A great American who started out many a morning on the American breakfast.
Dressing a little makes her feel and consequently look more charming. Even the table takes on a special air. Do you still remember these childhood recipes that fed a nation? There was a time when recipes weren't just about taste, they were about survival. They were made with hands that knew hunger, stretched across kitchens filled with laughter, ration stamps, and pride. Today, they're vanishing like dust in an old cookbook. But for those who lived through it, every bite is a story. Let's open that pantry of the past and revisit 30 unforgettable meals, starting with one that fooled more kids than you'd believe. Salsify fritters, the poor man's crab cake. You probably haven't heard the word salsify in decades, but back then it was the undercover hero of the dinner plate, especially when shellfish was out of reach. This humble root looked like a stick, tasted faintly like oysters, and when grated and mixed with egg and flour, it turned into golden, crispy fritters that sizzled in hot lard. Rolled oat meatloaf, the loaf that stretched $1.
Complete with seasoned breadcrumbs, a tasty tomato glaze, even a convenient throwaway pan. So it's simple to make an extra special family favorite.
This wasn't the meatloaf you slice at a fancy dinner. It was the one that stuck to your ribs after a school day and showed up in your lunch pail the next. Ground beef was expensive. Breadcrumbs were too. But oats? Oats were a miracle. Cheap, filling, and shelf-stable. Toss in some onion, a splash of milk, maybe an egg, and you had a loaf that baked up firm enough to cut, sturdy enough to travel, and rich enough to taste like more than it was. Molasses taffy pull, candy that took muscle. This wasn't just candy, it was an event, a tradition, a kitchen full of sticky hands and laughter that echoed off the walls. Molasses, sugar, a touch of vinegar, boiled down and poured onto a greased dish until it cooled just enough to grab. Then the pulling began. You'd stretch it, fold it, twist it like warm ribbon until your arms ached and your mouth watered. Some braided it, some rolled it into logs, and some just popped it in while it was still hot and soft. Oleomargarine with the magic capsule, a job for the kids.
This machine automatically separates margarine into half-pound pieces and perforates the date on the wrapping papers.
Before margarine came yellow, it came white, ghostly, sad, and cold, but hidden inside the package was a little capsule of color. And for kids, that was magic. They'd squeeze that sunshine dye into the block and knead it with their bare hands until the lard-like lump turned golden, like real butter. Stewed prunes, the breakfast, that whispered, not shouted. Stewed prunes didn't dazzle. They weren't flashy or loud. They arrived quietly in a ceramic bowl, glistening in syrup, soft enough to eat with the side of a spoon. Just dried fruit, simmered with sugar, maybe a stick of cinnamon or a lemon peel if your mother was feeling fancy. But the comfort they brought, unmatched. Served over oatmeal or eaten warm from a dish with cream, they were simple, gentle, and honest. Kids rolled their eyes until they tasted that sticky sweetness. Today they're a punchline, but once they were breakfast, dessert, and medicine all in one. And for those who remember, they're still the flavor of mornings that started slow and stayed warm. Mock chicken salad, the illusion that filled you up. There was no chicken in it. That was the point. When meat was for Sundays and every other day had to make do, this clever concoction came to the rescue. Crushed saltines, chopped boiled eggs, a spoonful of mayo, and maybe some mustard or celery if you were lucky. It was creamy, tangy, and satisfying in a way that felt richer than it was. Spread it between slices of white bread or dollop it on lettuce, and just like that, you had a school lunch, a picnic bite, or dinner on a desperate Tuesday. Fried cornmeal scrapple, the grit that got you through. You wouldn't find this on a restaurant menu, but you'd smell it before your feet hit the kitchen floor. Pork scraps, neck, liver, bones, trimmings, boiled down into broth, mixed with cornmeal, chilled into a block, and then sliced and fried until the outside snapped with grease and the inside stayed soft and heavy. Scrapple was farmer food, worker food, survival food. Some folks in Pennsylvania Dutch country swore by it. Others across the South and Midwest gave it their own spin. Syrup, eggs, mustard, everyone had their way. Creamed spinach on toast. Poverty. Proudly served no meat. No sides, no show, just toast, spinach, and a sauce so smooth it felt luxurious. Fresh spinach was a blessing. Canned worked fine, too. Simmered down in a white sauce made with butter, flour, and milk, it thickened into something rich enough to spoon over toast and eat with a knife and fork. Like a poor man's open-faced sandwich, it didn't pretend to be fancy, but it warmed your bones, filled your belly, and gave your mother the satisfaction of feeding the family with almost nothing. Baked custard with nutmeg, the dessert that calmed the room.
As a matter of fact, you even bake carnation custard in the same way. But oh, what a difference.
It wasn't flashy. It didn't beg for sprinkles or whipped cream, but when baked custard came out of the oven, golden on top, trembling just slightly in the middle, it brought peace to a house. Just milk, eggs, sugar, and a touch of fresh nutmeg if your grandmother had her way. Simple ingredients, treated with patience, transformed into something that felt elegant, even sacred. Served warm or cold, with fruit or without, it was dessert for ordinary days. Carrot, pineapple, gelatin salad, sunshine in a mold. It looked like Jell-O, but this wobbly block of orange was carrying vegetables under its skirt. Shredded carrots, crushed pineapple, maybe a bit of celery or chopped nuts. All suspended in citrus-flavored gelatin and chilled until firm. Kids saw the color and dove in. Parents knew it was the easiest way to get some nutrition down without complaints. Served cold next to meatloaf, ham, or turkey, it was part side dish, part trickery, part tradition. Bright, tangy, and crunchy all at once, it was the kind of dish that made its way into every family gathering without a second thought. Bread pudding with raisin sauce, when scraps became sacred.
Shake a pudding dessert mix from Royal.
This wasn't cake. It was survival dressed in cinnamon, old bread soaked in milk and sugar, baked until soft in the middle and crisp on top. But the secret? That dark, glossy raisin sauce. Sticky, sweet, and made from almost nothing, it turned yesterday's scraps into something that felt like Sunday. No recipes, no fanfare, just a quiet kind of love, ladled hot over memories. Canned Vienna, sausages with crackers, the lunchbox underdog. You didn't eat them for flavor. You ate them because they were there. Pop the lid, rinse the jelly, slap them on saltines. Boom, lunch. Kids built towers with them. Adults called it protein. In lunchboxes, glove compartments, or fishing tackle, Vienna sausages always showed up. Salty, squishy, strange, but dependable. They weren't pretty, but they never let you down. 13. Pickled pig's feet. The jar that dared you to be brave. They stared back at you through vinegar, daring you to take a bite. Cold, chewy, and tangy, pickled pig's feet weren't just food. They were a rite of passage. You didn't eat them by accident. You chose them, knowing full well what you were in for. In dusty stores and old trucks, these jars meant toughness. One bite, and you were part of a tradition too bold to forget. Fried green tomatoes, when waste became flavor green, tangy, fried to a golden crackle. These weren't Plan B, they were a Southern staple. Sliced from unripe tomatoes that couldn't wait, dipped in cornmeal and dropped in bacon grease, they came out crisp on the outside, sharp on the inside. Served hot, no garnish needed, just salt and maybe a little story. They weren't leftovers, they were legends. Creamed celery casserole, the quiet star at every table. No one cheered for it, but it always showed up. Chopped celery, softened just enough, folded into a creamy white sauce built from butter, milk, and patience. Poured into a battered casserole dish, topped with crumbs or crackers, and baked until bubbling and golden. It was never flashy, but it never failed. For families who stretched every meal, this simple dish wasn't filler. Potato pancakes with applesauce. When last night's leftovers became morning's glory, you could hear it before you saw it. That first hiss of cold mashed potatoes hitting a hot greased skillet, the quick sizzle, the smell of starch, salt, and fat rising together in harmony. And just like that, you knew what kind of morning it was going to be. Potato pancakes weren't planned. They were born out of scraps, shaped by necessity, and turned into something that felt like a little gift. Hominy with butter and salt, the grain that fed. Generations without saying a word. It didn't sparkle. It didn't sizzle. It didn't ask for your attention. But hominy, quiet, humble, butter-soaked hominy, was always there, sitting on the side of the plate like a quiet sibling, unassuming but essential. You didn't always notice it, but when it wasn't there, the meal felt like something was missing. Long before canned corn, before microwaves or pre-seasoned vegetable medleys, there was hominy. Dried corn kernels soaked in lye or wood ash, their hulls peeled away in a process that required patience and purpose. It was old, indigenous, sacred. This wasn't some instant side dish. It was food made by hands that understood what survival meant. By the time it made it to your plate, it had already been through so much. Washed, softened, boiled, but it never asked for anything fancy in return, just a pat of butter, a sprinkle of salt, and heat, slow heat. That was it. You'd stir the pot, watching the pale, swollen kernels bounce and tumble in the pan. They didn't pop like popcorn or bubble like stew. They just simmered, heavy with memory, and when they hit the plate, steaming hot and coated in melted butter, they offered something most people didn't expect: satisfaction, deep, warm, grounding satisfaction. Some folks browned it in a skillet to crisp the edges. Others stirred in cream or added a pinch of sugar. But in most homes, especially in the rural South, it was served straight, just salt and butter, maybe a little black pepper if someone felt fancy. You'd eat it alongside beans, pork chops, or greens, something earthy, something earned, and if there was any leftover, it got reheated the next day. No complaints. Children didn't jump for joy over hominy, but they ate it, and years later they remembered it, maybe more fondly than they expected, because hominy wasn't just a food, it was a rhythm, a presence, a reminder that even the plainest things, when treated with care, could fill a belly and anchor a memory. Cold macaroni salad with peas and pickles, the dish that showed up to every picnic, whether invited or not. You didn't need a calendar to know it was summer. All it took was one glance at the table at a church potluck, a family reunion, or a Sunday picnic in the backyard, and there it was, sitting proud in a big glass bowl that had been around longer than you had. Cold macaroni salad, speckled with peas and pickles, covered in a layer of plastic wrap pulled so tight it practically hummed. This was a dish that didn't change with trends. It didn't need to. Elbow macaroni cooked just past al dente. Soft, not mushy, rinsed in cold water to stop the cooking. Then came the peas. Canned, frozen, or fresh if someone's garden was generous. A scoop of chopped pickles, tangy, crunchy, unapologetic, cut through the creaminess. And finally, the glue that held it all together. Mayonnaise, lots of it, maybe a little vinegar or mustard for bite, maybe a dash of onion powder or a handful of chopped hard-boiled eggs if you were lucky. It was mixed with care and chilled overnight. That was the secret. It had to be cold, not fridge cold, picnic cold, the kind that still carried a slight chill even after sitting out on a folding table under the sun for 2 hours. When you scooped into it with a wide spoon, it made that soft sucking sound, the kind that meant the noodles had soaked in all the flavor. The salad clung to the utensil like it didn't want to be left behind, and when it hit your plate, wedged between a drumstick and a deviled egg, it brought balance. Rich, cool, tangy balance. This was the dish that could stretch across a crowd. It was inexpensive, forgiving, and endlessly adaptable. It didn't need a hot oven or a precise recipe. Just a big bowl, a mixing spoon, and a sense of practicality. Kids liked it because it was creamy and fun. Adults liked it because it filled space without breaking the budget. And the cooks who brought it? They knew it would always be finished by the end of the afternoon. Today, you'll find pasta salads dressed in olive oil, tossed with sun-dried tomatoes, goat cheese, and arugula. Beautiful, sure, but they don't stick to your ribs the way this one did. They don't carry the same echoes of backyard laughter, aluminum lawn chairs, and paper plates bending under the weight of homemade love. Cold macaroni salad with peas and pickles wasn't trying to impress. It was just trying to feed people, and it did that job perfectly. Somehow, between the elbow noodles and the chopped gherkins, it managed to taste like summer itself, cool, a little chaotic, and filled with the kind of memories that stick to your fingers long after the last bite. Tuna stuffed tomatoes, the fancy lunch you made with a can and a prayer. They looked elegant, little red bowls carved out of backyard summer, sitting on a bed of iceberg lettuce like they were waiting for a tea party. But behind that glossy tomato skin was the truth. This wasn't a luxury lunch. It was thrift, dressed up to feel special. A working woman's answer to a meal that had to be quick, cool, and still feel like it mattered. You started with the tomatoes, firm, ripe, slightly chilled from the windowsill or the root cellar. You'd slice off the top, scoop out the pulp, and hollow them like tiny edible bowls. The smell was unmistakable. Earthy, acidic, full of sun. These weren't grocery store tomatoes flown in from somewhere else. These were real, grown in your garden or the neighbor's, or traded at church for a dozen eggs. Then came the filling. A can of tuna, packed in oil or water, depending on what you could afford, drained and flaked into a bowl. Mayonnaise, of course, chopped celery for crunch, a bit of salt, a touch of pepper. If you had it, some onion or a hard-boiled egg mashed in to stretch it. Maybe even a squeeze of lemon or a spoonful of pickle juice if your grandmother had taught you the secret. You'd stir it all together by feel, not recipe. It had to be creamy, but not wet, bright, but not sharp. Then you'd gently pack it into the hollowed-out tomato until it mounded over like a scoop of ice cream on a summer cone. Sometimes it would be topped with a parsley sprig or a sliver of olive if you were feeling decorative, or if someone from church was coming over. It hit your tongue in layers. First, the snap of chilled tomato skin, then the soft, savory tuna, then the pop of celery and the tingle of brine, served cold with a glass of iced tea, maybe some crackers on the side. It was refreshing, filling, and felt like something better than it actually was. That was the magic of it. No oven, no frying pan, just one can, one vegetable, and the cleverness of someone who knew how to make dignity from odds and ends. These were the lunches your mother made when it was too hot to turn on the stove. The dishes that showed up at baby showers, Sunday luncheons, and bridge club meetings. Meals that whispered, "I care," without ever raising their voice. Kids didn't always love them. They wanted grilled cheese or peanut butter, but they'd eat them, and somewhere down the line they'd remember the smell, the cool snap of that tomato skin, the tang of the filling, and the way the kitchen felt quieter on days when nobody had to cook. Raisin-filled cookies, the sweet secret, hiding in Grandma's tin. These weren't the cookies you left out for Santa. They weren't flashy or sprinkled or wrapped in colored foil. No, these were different. They lived in a battered old tin on the highest kitchen shelf, behind the bread box, next to the recipe cards held together with a rubber band. And when that tin came down, when it creaked open and the smell hit you, you knew you were about to taste something worth remembering. While that cooled, the dough came together, soft, slightly spiced, rolled out on a floured board with that old wooden pin everyone's grandmother seemed to have. You didn't rush the process. You cut the dough into circles, just thick enough to hold the weight of the filling, and then dolloped a spoonful of the raisin paste in the center of half of them. Then came the seal. Another round of dough placed on top, edges pinched gently with a fork, or pressed down by hand. Some bakers got fancy and crimped them. Others poked little holes in the top so the filling wouldn't burst out during baking. But the look didn't matter. These cookies weren't meant to impress a party. They were meant to disappear quietly with coffee or be slipped into a lunchbox wrapped in wax paper. When they baked, the smell filled the whole house. Brown sugar, spice, warm fruit, and nostalgia rising in the oven like a memory you didn't know you missed. The edges browned just a bit. The centers stayed soft, and the raisin filling turned molten, held between two golden layers of cookie like a hug between old friends. You didn't eat just one. You savored them, biting slowly, letting the center coat your tongue before the crumb melted around it. It wasn't sugary sweet like today's treats. It was deeper, earthier, comforting in a way that felt personal. These cookies didn't come in plastic packaging. They came from tired hands and quiet afternoons. They were made by women who remembered war rationing, who knew what it meant to stretch ingredients and still put something special on the table. And if you were lucky enough to get the last one in the tin, you felt like royalty. Today, raisin-filled cookies are nearly extinct. You won't find them in bakeries or supermarkets, maybe in a faded church cookbook, maybe scribbled on a yellowing index card tucked behind the spice jars. But if you remember them, you don't just remember a snack. You remember the whole kitchen, the smell, the quiet, the feeling of being cared for, because some recipes weren't just about flavor. They were about time, about effort, about someone saying, without saying a word, "You're worth it." Jellied chicken loaf, the cold cut that told a war-era love story. It jiggled, it gleamed, it dared you to try it, and it didn't care what you thought. Jellied chicken loaf was one of those dishes that sat proudly on the table, unapologetically weird, somehow elegant, and unmistakably from another era. To understand this recipe, you have to understand the time. There were no Costco rotisserie chickens, no deli counters with 50 sandwich meats lined up in glass cases. Meat was rationed, kitchens were hot, and people had learned the art of making food stretch, not with substitutes, but with style. This loaf wasn't just thrift. It was an invention born of control, a way to shape leftovers into something worthy of a tablecloth. It started with poached chicken, usually a whole bird, boiled until the meat was soft enough to shred with a fork. You didn't toss the bones. You simmered them down with carrot tops, celery ends, and bay leaves until you had a broth rich enough to float a spoon. That broth would become your base, your glue. You added unflavored gelatin, not the fruity kind, just the plain powder, to the warm broth and stirred until it dissolved into clarity. Next came the meat, shredded chicken, sometimes finely chopped carrots or peas for color, maybe a few celery bits or parsley if you wanted to get fancy. All of it gently folded into the cooled, thickened broth until it looked like something between a salad and a soup. Then you poured it into a loaf mold, glass or tin, and left it to chill overnight, tucked in the fridge beside a bowl of potato salad and a dish of canned pears. The next day, you'd turn it out with a careful hand, a cold, clear block of shimmering protein. Each slice, smooth, firm, and freckled with vegetables like confetti frozen in time. You'd lay it out on a plate with crisp lettuce leaves and serve it with a dollop of mayonnaise or a spoonful of mustard cream. And here's the thing. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't ironic. This was food that said, "We made it work." It was quiet pride molded into slices. No heat, no waste, no fuss. This dish didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It didn't try to be warm or cheesy or indulgent. It was honest, clean, refreshing in a time when fridges were still a luxury and cold meals were a blessing in July. You'd find jellied chicken loaf at luncheons, funeral receptions, and Sunday spreads when guests came by unexpectedly. It traveled well, held its shape, and looked like you'd put in more effort than you actually had. That was part of its charm. It was a trick of presentation, a lesson in how to stretch a single chicken across 5 days and still feel like you were eating something new. Kids looked at it sideways. Some adults did too, but those who knew. They knew what it stood for. Today, It's all but vanished. The word gelatin makes people flinch, but once upon a time it was the signature of a careful hand and a clever kitchen. It was a kind of culinary courage, one that didn't need applause, but still deserved respect, because jellied chicken loaf wasn't about indulgence. It was about dignity, a chilled slice of ingenuity on a plate that said, "We didn't waste, we fed everyone, and we did it with grace." Apple Brown Betty, the dessert that smelled like hope in a cold house. It wasn't a pie, it wasn't a crumble, it wasn't a cobbler, but it lived in the same drawer of memory, right next to them. The Apple Brown Betty didn't need a fancy name to leave a mark. It already had one that sounded like a character in a bedtime story, and maybe that's what it was. Not just a dessert, but a reminder that sweetness didn't require wealth, that comfort could come from crusts and scraps and the things most people threw away. Brown Betty was the dessert you made when there wasn't enough of anything else. Not enough flour for pie dough, not enough butter for cake, not enough sugar for cookies. But apples, those you could find in the backyard, on the neighbor's tree, a paper sack from the farmer's market filled with bruised ones that didn't sell. And bread, always there, always aging quietly in the bread box, edges dry, crusts curled. You'd peel and slice the apples, thin so they'd bake evenly. Tart apples were best. Granny Smith or whatever grew from that gnarled tree behind the shed. Then you'd tear the bread into crumbs, not the neat kind from a food processor, but the kind made by hand, rubbed between fingers until it turned soft and uneven. In a baking dish, usually the one with the hairline crack on the corner, you'd start the layering, apples, crumbs, a sprinkle of brown sugar, a pat of butter, then again, no measuring, just instinct, a little cinnamon, maybe a touch of nutmeg if you were lucky. Then into the oven it went. That was the real beginning. The smell would creep out of the kitchen and wrap around the house like a warm blanket. Baked apples and butter and spice. You didn't need a timer. You just waited until the scent turned thick and deep, until it filled your lungs and your bones and made the hardest day feel like it was finally ending. When it came out, the top would be golden, the bottom soft and syrupy. You'd spoon it into chipped bowls, maybe with milk or cream, or even just on its own. It wasn't neat, it wasn't pretty, but it was perfect, especially when eaten standing at the stove, still too hot, the steam curling up into your face. This was the dessert that showed up when you needed it most, on rainy Tuesdays, during war rations, after funerals, after layoffs, after long nights waiting for the phone to ring. It didn't announce itself like cake or demand celebration like pie. It whispered instead, quiet comfort, warm from the inside out. And for many, it became tradition without ever being declared one. Mothers taught daughters. Grandfathers made it when no one else would. It didn't live on a recipe card. It lived in muscle memory. Today, Apple Brown Betty barely gets mentioned in cookbooks, but those who remember, they don't need a recipe. They just need apples and stale bread. And a reason, because sometimes the best desserts don't celebrate anything. They save you. They remind you that home isn't just a place. It's a smell, a spoonful, a quiet promise. We'll get through this, and there will be something warm waiting when we do. Beef heart stew, the meal that taught you strength could be tender. 2. It didn't look like the kind of meat you'd see in a butcher's window. It didn't come neatly sliced or marbled or shrink-wrapped in plastic. It was heavy, dense, pulled from the chest cavity of an animal whose every heartbeat echoed through the stew pot like a second chance. Beef heart stew wasn't glamorous. It wasn't celebrated, but it was there, simmering on the stove when families needed something rich, something real, and something that could stretch across 6 plates with nothing but potatoes, time, and love. You started with the trimming. That was the hard part. Removing the sinew, the connective tissue, the veins that told you exactly what part of the animal you were working with. It took patience, a good knife, and someone who wasn't afraid of the truth, because this was food with a face, with weight, with purpose. Once cleaned, the heart was chopped into chunks, not too big, not too small. Then browned in a deep pot with onions and garlic until the smell filled the room with something bold and ancient. After that, you'd pour in the broth, beef stock, or even just water seasoned with salt and pepper, and add whatever vegetables you had. Carrots, potatoes, maybe a handful of turnips, herbs from the backyard, or dried ones from a jar that had sat in the cupboard for years. And then you waited, not 5 minutes, not 10. You let it cook low and slow for hours until the meat softened, not just cooked, but transformed, because beef heart was lean, sure, but it was also strong. You couldn't rush it. You had to earn it. But when it gave in, when it surrendered to the broth and the flame and the patient stirring of someone who knew what they were doing, it became tender in a way that was almost shocking. The stew thickened. The flavors deepened. And when it was ladled into bowls, steaming, fragrant, hearty, you didn't ask questions. You just ate, and you felt full in a way that had nothing to do with calories. This was food that reminded you where you came from, that nothing should be wasted, that every part of the animal had value, that working-class kitchens were built not on excess, but on reverence for labor, for life, for nourishment earned the hard way. Kids didn't always know what they were eating. They just knew it was good, that it tasted like Sunday, like being safe, like coming home from school and smelling something familiar before you even opened the door. Today, beef heart is pushed to the edges of meat counters if it's sold at all. It's labeled awful, dismissed by people who've never known real hunger, never watched a parent stretch a single cut of meat into 2 nights of dinners and a week's worth of leftovers. But for the people who remember, who grew up on Depression-era meals, on war rations, on the teachings of parents who knew the weight of waste, beef heart stew wasn't just a dish. It was a statement, a lesson that even the hardest things, with time and care, could be made soft. That toughness, when cooked with love, could turn into something that filled your stomach and stayed in your soul. Rice and raisin casserole, the sweet you shared. When sugar was scarce, it didn't shimmer, it didn't rise, it didn't have icing or frosting or sprinkles, but it had something else, something softer, something older. The rice and raisin casserole was never meant to dazzle. It was meant to soothe, a warm hug on a hard day, a quiet yes when the rest of the world said no. This was dessert born from leftovers and longing, from a spoonful of rice that wasn't enough for a full plate, but too sacred to throw away, from a handful of raisins rattling in a tin at the back of the cupboard, from a mother or grandmother standing over the stove with tired feet, wondering how to turn not enough into just enough. You started with rice, cooked fresh or saved from last night's dinner. White rice, plain and soft. It didn't need to be fancy, it just needed to be there. The raisins came next, soaked sometimes in warm water or milk to plump them up. And then you'd make the custard, milk, eggs, sugar, and a whisper of vanilla or nutmeg if your pantry allowed. Everything was folded together gently, like it might break under pressure, then poured into a buttered baking dish, usually chipped at the edges, the kind that had served every family meal for 20 years. You'd place it in the oven and wait, not just for it to bake, but for the house to change. Because once the scent began to rise, sweet milk, soft rice, warming sugar, it filled the air with something no store-bought dessert ever could, peace. The top would brown just slightly, forming a delicate crust. The inside stayed soft, like pudding, like memory. You served it warm, always warm, with a splash of cream if there was any left, or just on its own, spooned into chipped bowls, steam curling into the air like a sigh of relief. This wasn't a dessert for celebration. It was a dessert for consolation, for after funerals, after layoffs, after long, aching winters. It was the kind of food you made when you couldn't afford joy, so you crafted comfort instead. Kids didn't clamor for it. They didn't ask for seconds the way they did with pie, but years later they remembered. They remembered the quiet clink of the spoon in the casserole dish, the way the raisins sank like hidden treasure, the stillness of the kitchen when the only light came from the oven and the only sound was someone softly stirring. This dish didn't travel. You didn't bring it to potlucks or serve it at birthdays. It lived inside the walls of your own home, behind the stories nobody told and the strength nobody praised. Today, you'll find rice pudding in plastic cups at the supermarket, prepackaged, flavored, shelf-stable, but it's not the same. It doesn't carry the hush of hardship or the softness of survival. It doesn't taste like your mother's hands or the silence she kept while stirring, because rice and raisin casserole wasn't just dessert. It was a reply to the world when the world was unkind, a way of saying, we still have warmth, we still have sweetness, we still have each other, even if all we have left is rice, raisins, and a little bit of faith.